US case just a few weeks ago, there is this notion that engaging with politics or thinking about politics in any regard is associated with increased anxiety, depression, and stress. So the question that's posed here is how mental health and one's political engagement might actually be interrelated. And it's very likely that this relationship goes both ways. So is politics impacting mental health, but also is mental health impacting one's political attitudes and behaviors? So some work that's been done does suggest that poor mental health is associated with reduced political motivation and engagement. And this is specifically when talking about depression. So depression has that kind of demotivating impact when it comes to if we vote or the likelihood to turn out for an election. It's also been suggested that poor mental health is associated with greater political engagement. So engaging with politics might correlate with feeling worse in general. And so again, the causal direction is not necessarily investigated in most of these studies, and it's likely that it definitely goes both ways. In order to begin to determine the nuance in this relationship, there has been a turn to political domain-specific constructs. For example, Weinscheck and Smith, 2024, created the term political anxiety. And this is the idea that there is anxiety that's specific to politics that is distinct from a generalized anxiety that one experiences day to day. They find specifically that those who are more interested in politics demonstrate greater political anxiety, and that the rate of political anxiety was higher when compared to that of general anxiety. They also came up with a term called political health, and this is an idea that different domains of health are kind of all in one here. So it's social health, emotional health, and what they find is that worse political health is reported by those on the left side of the political spectrum, in younger individuals, and in those who are, again, more politically interested. However, this turn to political domain specificity has been helpful, but there's still a lot of questions to be answered. They usually stick to looking at demographics, so who is more likely to be more negatively affected by politics, and some political correlates such as anxiety and turnout to vote. So there's still a question as to how political mental health or mental health in general relates to these phenomenons and behaviors that we see popping up in different nations, such as support for populism, the rise of affective polarization, radicalism, and so on. And so this study helps address some of these questions and also looks to how different types of mental health might actually relate to one another in this political arena. So we ask a few questions. The first is, to what extent does mental health relate to relevant phenomena and behaviors? So we're going to look just at mental health as it is. The second is, to what extent does political domain-specific mental health relate to these same relevant phenomena and behaviors? And the third would be, to what extent do these two compare? So how does mental health and domain-specific mental health compare in relation to these different political correlates? So again, just to go over our contributions here, we test and compare the construct and predictive validity of our measures. So we create a political mental health and general health measure, and we compare them across a range of political correlates, moving beyond demographics and towards different political outcomes. So I'll briefly talk you through kind of how we created these scales. We start with political health. So we take the already existing political health scale from Smith 2018, and we take the PHQ-4, which is a measure for anxiety and depression, and we adapt it to become political. So an example here would be feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge. That's the actual question. And then we include about politics. For the general health measure, we try to construct it to be as closely matching to the political health measure as possible. So we actually created the general health measure, 10 items that try to match the political health as closely as possible. And we take the PHQ-4 for anxiety and depression. So the idea here was that we would have a general health and a political health, and then we would have anxiety and depression, political anxiety, political depression. So 3 distinct forms of health that we could then test and compare among one another. So what we did was we first pre-registered a split half approach, and we collected data in the Netherlands. So this is a Dutch sample, and it was collected last December with an N of around 2,000. We first ran exploratory analyses to explore the construct validity of our scales. And so what we did, because the item wordings were so closely matched, we gave half of the respondents the general items and half the political items. So not everyone did not answer both, just so that's clear. So we ran item response models, so graded response models, to explore our construct validity. We pre-registered our expectations, and then we confirmed these on the second half of the data. We then explored the predictive validity of our scales in relation to different correlates, pre-registered our expectations, and confirmed those on the second half of the data, just to give you a rundown of what this study looked like. So when we put everything into our grade response model, they actually loaded onto one latent dimension. So instead of getting anxiety, depression, and health, we got a mental health category, and similar for the political items. So we ended up terming this political mental health. So this is a more holistic, kind of overarching approach to understanding health in politics. To test and compare the predictive validity of these scales, we ran some linear regressions. The outcome variable was the political correlate, and we made a dummy variable with political mental health as 1, general mental health as 0, and we interacted that with mental health to consider the differential effects between groups. We controlled for age, gender, and education. So I'm going to walk you through, these are the confirmatory tests. So this is the second split half results. The political correlates that we used are on the left hand side, and the estimates are down below. Political mental health is in blue, and general mental health is in red. So what you see first is that for these correlates up top, we label political sophistication. And this is just a label. We're terming this for now, but also we're very open to ideas. So if you have any ideas about how to group these, you can definitely let us know. So what we find here is that political interest, those who are more politically interested, demonstrate worse mental health, but also worse political mental health. And there is actually a significant difference between these two groups, suggesting that political mental health has a more strongly correlated relationship to being interested in politics. We label this group here political engagement. So this is where you have activism, affective polarization, conspiracy belief, ideological extremism, and support for populism. And so interestingly, what you find here is that for activism, affective polarization, and conspiracy belief, and for ideological extremism, you have a stronger effect for political mental health as compared to mental health. And there's a significant difference between these. So this suggests that in order to detect the relationship between mental health and some of these political correlates, you might need domain specificity to pick it up. So a few takeaways from this so far is that mental health and political domain-specific mental health seem to have more far-reaching political consequences than the literature previously assumed. And again, in order to spot the impact of mental health for those in the political extremes, political domain specificity may be needed. And yeah, so that's it, and I look forward to your questions.
I guess one question is, where do you want to go with this political mental health question? Also, so how well can you differentiate it from the general mental health? I think you showed that a little bit now. And maybe also like in the models that you have, you now have always predicted by the different political variables. Do you also have like a directional hypothesis in your mind that you want to test with the political mental health and the different outcomes or reasons for mental health?
So is your question about like if mental health predicts these outcomes, or
like what directionality you have in mind?
Let's see. Well, I really do think it's a relationship that does go both ways, and I think it would depend on the individual. So I think there might be different groups of people that relate to politics differently, right? So I do think for the activism, the affectively polarized, those who are more ideologically extreme, they might all be kind of one and the same group. In which case you could make the argument that the more you engage, the worse you feel. Because when you're so involved, it could just become very overwhelming.
Yeah.
So that could be the direction there. But I think for a majority of people, especially with that demotivation that previous literature has found, it might also just be, I stay away from politics because I know it makes me feel bad. So I think there's different things. Yeah.
I also have a question. Do you have any thoughts about whether this is more of a built on states or more built on reactions? You know what I mean? I mean, we've briefly discussed this before. Who has worse political mental health? Is this correlated in terms of if you're associated with an incumbent or not, or what else could predict it? What do you think?
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think a lot of it does have to do with, depends, like in a very polarized context like the US, we can argue that it definitely has a lot to do with who's currently winning an election. So you'll see, and they do suggest that, okay, those in the political left have more of a tendency to show worse health effects from dealing with politics. So it could have an ideological kind of spin as well. There is some work that suggests conservatives are happier, or, so there could be something there. But we also ran some models that look at personality and mental health, political mental health. The only thing we really saw was that for mental health, there's a stronger correlation to what you would expect. So neuroticism, self-esteem. But we didn't find anything too notable when it comes to political mental health.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I have a question about what is meant with political, because in the climate anxiety literature, for example, political activism is seen as a coping strategy and might actually help with mental health. So I wonder if you think about some differences in, what do the participants see as political? What do you see as political?
Yeah, no, it's a good question and a good point. I think that's the thing, is there's so much nuance in all of these relationships. Yeah, I think the activism literature is pretty big in that it shows how there's this back and forth between feeling hope and then feeling despair. So I'm not, this certainly wouldn't pick up any of that nuance. What do we mean by political? Again, it's very subjective, and so I think leaving the term open, and then, like you said, maybe interviews would be a good next direction to really understand how people perceive what political means to them and how it affects them in their well-being. Yeah.
And Matthijs first, and then Gustavo.
Thanks, Delaney. I was wondering, could you reflect a little bit on the normative implications of the term of mental political health? I could imagine, for instance, that it is a term that could be ascribed to some politicians and that they're not really mentally healthy. So that is like a different connotation that people could have with the term.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, I was also wondering, I could also imagine that it has a very positive connotation for some, because with the idea in the current political circumstances, how can you feel politically healthy, for instance? So that's different ways in which it has different moral or normative connotations.
Yeah.
So could you reflect a bit on that?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point. I think it's important to distinguish too, when talking about political mental health, that it doesn't translate one-on-one with a general conception of mental health diagnostically, right? So I think it'll be important to ground that in when we write up this paper. But yeah, I see what you're saying. I think this term could be kind of co-opted depending on the ideology one has or where they sit on the political spectrum, like you're saying. And given the fact that it does seem to be those on the left who display more health issues with politics, I can see it easily becoming a bit of a polarized term. But yeah, this is the very beginning of really considering what domain specificity means in relation to mental health and politics. So I'll have to think more on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was also looking at these effect sizes, and I was wondering, with the first part that is political sophistication, it's not as clear if there might be like very big differences between them or at all, right? Like in terms of directions, either with mental health or political mental health. And then I look at engagement, which might be more connected to affective associations rather than just semantic, like in the sophistication part. And that's where you see that it does seem to be quite connected to the domain where you have very strong engagement. So it could be that the more engaged you are in politics, the more likely you are to experience strong emotions connected to events. It's more core to your identity. And then maybe because of that broader range of valence and arousal reactions, that for me, a question would be, okay, so would it also be true that they also have more positive feelings for politics, not just negative?
That's a very good question. Yeah.
But then another question I had is, well, maybe politics is just more of a negative domain where people mostly have negative emotions. what do you think about this? Do you think that this would be true? Do you think that people would also have very strong positive emotions that balance it out?
My initial intuition would say no. I do think it's more of a negative domain across the board, and that's probably true for both. I'm saying both sides because I'm in a US polarized mind state, I'm sorry, for the extremes, right? So I don't know, there's also that kind of push towards negative campaigning, negativity bias, and I think I would say that it's mostly negative, even if there are moments of camaraderie or hope that kind of gets activated when you're engaging activism, for example. But yeah, that would be my thought.
And I go to Philip, Gijs, and then
Yeah, thanks, Delaney, for the work. And yeah, I definitely think it's to follow this work, but I have now a question. Like, I am, of course, also following it sort of through my own lens, personal experience with the selection, etc. And I'm wondering, yeah, trying to grasp what kind of people these might be and what kind of people, what kind of experiences they might have. And I thought one thing that is might be correlating with like, political mental health would be some sort of fatalistic view of the world, right? Disparities. And then I thought it's interesting how efficacy is, at least for mental health, negatively correlated with like negatively correlated. And I thought maybe the gap between what you think you can do, like efficacy, like I can change something, and you actually doing something, activism, like it might actually be a discontent with one's own position in the politics. So I thought whether maybe you have the power to interact those two, to like see whether sort of like people who are engaging in activism and believe like they can do something. How they feel about
Yeah, that's a really
versus people who feel like I could do something, I could change something, but I'm actually not changing anything. And those would group people into different kind of like, is it this fatalistic thing of like, oh, you can't do anything and therefore I feel that, or is it more like I could do something but I'm just fucked down? So I thought, or have you thought a bit about like what these like with efficacy? I don't know. For me, this is a bit mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's not what we expected.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, and I'm definitely gonna look into that.
Did you mean statistical power or the power in?
Yeah. This now I thought about
Yeah, I think the next step would be to try to understand different groups that are represented in this. Because I think we have a few things going on.
Yeah, even
Yeah.
just like spinning a story with a clustering kind of like type
Yeah,
of groups would be curious.
Yeah. well, that's a good idea.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, now that you're presenting these results, I'm thinking that the dependent variable is actually constructed in the wrong direction, right? I mean,
Oh, you mean
High
just how
men-
it's, yeah.
high
okay.
mental health is actually mental unhealth, which made me think.
Yeah, so it's worse,
Yeah.
the worse you feel.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but how would you label that?
how would I label?
A mentally unhealthy.
I think
I
like,
would just invert it in my view, because every time I see your graphs, I always think it should be the other way.
it's funny because I find this more intuitive, but no one
Yeah.
else does.
Yeah.
I'll change it,
I
Yeah.
feel like when we talk about mental health, we're not always like, oh, yeah, I'm feeling great. Let's talk about mental health implies you're talking about how bad.
Fair,
your mental
yeah.
How about,
Yeah.
I mean, you're really interested in regulation. Maybe that's because you're kind of implicitly thinking about this regulation.
When I do this?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely, yeah, because mental health is actually a term we use to describe the inner workings of our nervous system. So anxiety would be like you're a bit dysregulated, but you tend up, so more hyper aroused, and depression would be the other way around. But I get what you're saying here with that direction.
Also with you, I want to present myself. So I'm a PhD student in social psychology, and I work or will work more on activist mental health.
Oh, amazing.
And the emotional experience. So very interesting work. And my question also goes in this direction. You think you did an aggregate general how is mental health of people? Do you think would you expect temporal changes over days? And does your scale also allow to assess mental health or the mental status in one day in comparison a week later or the following day? Like this maybe help to come into the causal relations. If I'm active this day, my mental health is worse or better the next day, and this doesn't then predict.
Yeah, no, that's a really good idea. We don't have the ability to do that with this data, but it's a very good idea moving forward. And I do think more so with this political mental health as opposed to general mental health, it's more of an acute thing, right? So there's probably more spikes and then come downs, depending on what you interact with that day.
Could you use your scale for that? Like,
Oh, could we use, yeah, we could. So we could give people that battery, different times of the day or over a span of time. Yeah.
We have a question, my third.
Yeah, I have a point of caution and a question. The point of caution is a little bit, there's so many comparisons here
Mhm.
that the conclusions depend a little bit on where you draw the comparisons, right? So
Yeah.
now you focus on within activism, the difference, but you could also compare the mental health coefficients across the different models.
Mhm.
And if you do that, then actually political mental health across the board, the results, the difference between sophistication and engagement are really not that different. If you look at the blue coefficients, right? If you would test the differences between the models.
Okay.
So I think, but this is where the question comes from. This is a bit self-reflection. Do you agree with me that we might have pre-registered the wrong modeling strategy? Because here we're modeling every time mental health is the independent variable on an outcome.
Yeah.
But these outcomes are correlated with each other. And so should the correct modeling strategy not be to explain mental health and control for, I mean, see what the effect of polarization, keeping constant conspiracy belief, because, right, or keeping constant activism, because currently all the variation is every time in
Yeah, I
one
see.
variable.
Yeah.
So do you agree with me with that, or do you say no, we pre-registered the right model? And I explicitly say
Good
we
question.
and not you.
I mean, yeah, I think there's different ways to go about it, right? I don't think this is wrong in the sense where I don't think we made a mistake.
I did it right, you get it wrong.
Well, actually, we were in it together. But no, it's also an interesting point, and yeah, I think we could run those models either way.
Yeah, because I think I'd be curious if if we arrive at the same conclusions.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Also depends conceptually on whether you are interested in it as a predictor or as an outcome. And I think it's also valid to look at it as a predictor.
Yeah.
Yeah, although the correlational design doesn't really
Yeah.
allow us
Yeah.
to, right? So
But if we're
Theoretically speaking, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But just a short follow-up regarding this, double-sidedness, and of course you cannot study it with that, but I think that again emphasizes how cool or insightful it might be to look at a more exploratory kind of clustering of what type of people might fall into higher or lower.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
I was wondering, would you want to take this to an experimental design where you try to find momentary causal outcomes, or would you rather keep this on a general level? I could see both. I think it would be really cool if we could find clear manipulations, but then again, I could also imagine that the underlying mechanisms and the underlying perceptions are so large that it's going to be really hard to influence them
Right.
experimentally. So where do you see this going towards more? Do you see this going towards an experimental study, or would you rather work it out to further in terms of survey applications?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first maybe just grounding ourselves more in what this is through survey would make sense, but eventually moving towards an experiment. And
donate some hair.
yes.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I
Um,
should be stressed before.
That's a 6 months fix.
6 months. No, take 6 months. But yeah, I think you could actually trigger the political mental health far more than mental health in the case where if it's really this acute thing and you have associations with certain political content, then I think it would be easy to manipulate.
Yeah.
Depending on the side of the aisle, I think you sit on and what you're exposed to. But
Challenging ethics application, but
yes,
that's true.
That's true.
I do think that having physiological access to this would be quite nice, because one thing I wonder is how much of this is just, I don't like how the political environment is right now, so I'm not happy about it. it makes me depressed, but maybe I'm not really that depressed. It's just that I want to say that I'm depressed because I don't
There's
like
also
it.
that component of things.
So
Yeah. Yeah, I think I will say, just from anecdotal experience dealing with the United States and people there right now, it's a real thing. Some people are really experiencing depressive anxiety-like symptoms because of what's happened. But again, it really depends on the type of person and their situation in relation to the political context. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks so much again, Delaney, for this really interesting presentation.
All right. First of all, you see there's a lot going on here, so there are a lot of people to thank, especially I think Evelina and Lisanne, who are not here today, obviously with the supervisors. They are from the Sync Lab of Erasmus University. This is the first time I'm presenting that work, so I'm also happy to get some comments on the framing and everything. And it's on the exploration of several data sets about adolescence and affective polarization. With affective polarization, I mean the liking of one's political in-group combined with dislike for the political out-group. And it has sparked a lot of attention, especially in connection with adolescence, since some recent findings from the US, for example, claim that adolescents are increasingly polarized. I'm going to mainly want to make 3 claims in the presentation, or 3 findings that I have on additional on exploratory data analysis. The first thing is that affective polarization adolescents might develop earlier than we would expect based on existing theories. Secondly, I want to compare adolescents and adults and want to show that in contrast to the United States, in the Netherlands, adolescents might still be a little less polarized than adults. And finally, I want to show that the levels of affective polarization in adolescents are modulated by external events, for example, the Dutch elections last year. So a little bit background on the developmental perspective. Adolescence is often located between 10 and 25, so it starts biologically, and then it's often also related to the transition into a different societal role from a strong dependence on caregivers to more of an independent role within society, and is associated with a heightened sensitivity to socio-political cues. If we look at the political socialization literature and also developmental psychological research, we often find the term impressionable years, which is a key phase for certain developments. And in the political socialization literature, people also claim that there is a key phase for the development of political attitudes and preferences, so that there is kind of like an attitude crystallization process. And people still debate where to locate this process or what the most important years are, but the timing is often put around the age of legal voting. So the first research question would be, to what extent does affective polarization differ across different stages of adolescence? Some background on the comparative perspective. When we look at adults and adolescents, early research has shown that adolescents are less polarized. So they develop a political identity quite early, or partisan identity, but they have weak affective ties. So they don't have that strong feelings for their in-group or their political out-groups. And reasons for that would be, for example, that they see politicians generally as more positive, or that they just mimic the attitudes of their parents without having strong emotional connections to their attitudes. But recently there has been some research from the United States claiming that adolescents have caught up with adults when it comes to affective polarization, and now there's actually no gap between the two. So the second question would be, does it replicate in the Netherlands? How do adolescents and adults compare here in the Netherlands? And the last one is an influence perspective. So it has been shown that affective polarization is not only shaped by individual characteristics, but also by external societal events, for example, election cycles or other key events that heighten the salience of party competition or political identities in general, and they can lead to an increase in affective polarization. And we want to see if this increase in affective polarization or this fluctuation in relationship to external events also takes place among adolescents. So let's start with the first research question: when does it develop? And the first data source we took is the Urban Rotterdam study. And there we collected data in the May of last year from 500 adolescents. And we obviously measured age, but we also measured affective polarization with the feeling thermometers. So we asked for a set of parties, how much do you like or dislike them? And then we calculated metrics of affective polarization. That can be how much the liking spreads across the different political parties, also the mean distance from the most liked in-group. Now I'm going to mainly focus on the results for spread, but the results replicate across all different metrics that we calculated. And yeah, this was a convenient sample from the broader urban Rotterdam area collected via the university website and also social media and so on. Here I plot age on the x-axis and affective polarization on the y-axis. So what would we expect? If we see the affective polarization developing, we would assume that over time, or as adolescents grow older, even though that's not a longitudinal sample, that's a cross-sectional sample, but we would expect that the older adolescents have clearer political positions, thus clearer patterns of like and dislike across the political parties, and therefore higher levels of affective polarization. But what we find is that it's essentially a flat line between, well, I guess here that's not very really reliable because we don't have enough data points, but maybe between 14 and 23, it's almost a flat line. And running Bayesian linear models, we also find strong evidence for the absence of linear or quadratic age effects. This finding took us a little bit by surprise, which is why we want to replicate it. And we replicated it using data that we collected with the doctoral network that I'm part of. And those data sets cover 1,000 adolescents each in the Netherlands, Austria, Greek, Poland, and the UK. Participants were between 15 and 21. The samples were stratified by gender and region, and we also collected the peeling thermometers as measures of affective polarization. In the Netherlands, we see that this flat line replicates, so we really have no relationship between linear or other shaped relationship between age and affective polarization in the Netherlands. And interestingly, the flat line also replicates in Austria, the UK, Greece, and Poland. So first conclusion with regards to this research question, to what extent does affective polarization differ across different stages of adolescence, is the level is relatively stable across the different ages that we look at. And something that I haven't shown yet is that if we partition people into different age brackets, the variance within the age brackets also doesn't differ. This would, I guess, be, if it would be higher for young adults, that would be an indication that maybe they're worse at responding to the question if we have more variance. So a sensitive period for the development of affective polarization may be even earlier than we would have expected based on this impressionable years hypothesis. The second question is, how do adolescents and adults compare? And here it gets a little bit complicated because we have a lot of different data sources. The first one is the iPad survey that I've talked about before, but just looking at the Netherlands, because this is the only country where we have a comparison sample. The second one is the Urban Rotterdam study that I've shown initially. And then our comparison sample is the LIS panel, which is a large representative sample of adults in the Netherlands. And this sample, I again partitioned into people that would be, according to our definition, adolescents, so between 16 and 25, and people that would be adults, so older than 25. And the measure of affective polarization here is the same. Now I'm going to show you how adolescents and adults compare in terms of affective polarization. Another thing that complicates that a little bit is that we covered different parties in the feeling thermometers in the iPad survey and in the Urban Rotterdam study, which is why I have one LIS sample or one affective polarization metric in the LIS sample that uses the exact same parties as in the iPad survey, and one sample or set of parties in the LIS sample that uses the exact same parties in the Rotterdam study, just to make the metrics as comparable as possible. So if we compare adults and adolescents in the LIS sample and with the party combinations that were used in the iPad survey, we see that there's actually 0.4 standard deviation difference between adults and adolescents, in the sense that adolescents are less polarized, less affectively polarized than adults. In this, we also replicate by looking at the within difference between adolescents and adults in the LIS panel. If we look at the Urban Rotterdam study, this is the only comparison where we do not find evidence, or we find evidence against the difference between adults and adolescents. But if we look again, within this comparison, we do find that adolescents have significantly lower levels of affective polarization than adults, which makes us think that this year that the adolescents in the urban Rotterdam sample are as polarized as adults might be due to the convenience sample from the urban Rotterdam area and not due to the selected parties for this affective polarization metric, because otherwise we wouldn't have expected to see this difference here. And finally, does the level of affective polarization differ between adolescents and adults? Doing okay in time. Oh no, this is what I've just talked about. So contrasting previous findings from the United States, does adolescents seem to be still a little bit less polarized than adults. And what we're currently doing is we're trying to still find comparison samples from the other countries to replicate this finding. This is the last research question. Does the level of affective polarization among adolescents change across the course of the parliamentary elections? Another data source slide. What I haven't talked about yet is that the Urban Rotterdam study is actually also a longitudinal panel study. And so we had a second wave of data collection where we assessed affective polarization with the same measures right after the Dutch general elections in December 2023. And then we had a third wave of data collection this year in October, so almost a year after the Dutch parliamentary elections. And we now will look at how affective polarization developed among the participants that participated in all three waves of data collection. Obviously, you can see that we have considerable dropout from around 500 to 114. So I checked some sample characteristics. The adolescents in this group don't differ from the adolescents that dropped out in terms of the overall level of affective polarization, in terms of age, in terms of their political engagement, or in terms of their expressed need to contribute to society. The sample here is, if we look at the proportions, a little bit more female than the dropout sample, better educated and has a higher socioeconomic status, which is why we control for those variables when we strike the comparisons across the different time points. So here we have the different waves on the x-axis and affective polarization on the y-axis. And what we first see is if we compare wave one, this was 6 months before the election, to right after the election, our affective polarization level has actually increased by 0.3 standard deviations, which is, again, quite substantial increase. And if we look what happened to 1 year after the election, we do have some evidence for a decrease of affective polarization again after 1 year. I must say though that this result, it's not really conclusive if we look at the base factor, which might be due to limited power since we only have 114 participants for this comparison. But yeah, we have some evidence and it goes in the direction that we would expect it to go. So it reduces against after the spike directly directly after the Dutch parliamentary elections. So our conclusion here would be higher affective polarization levels are reported immediately after the Dutch parliamentary elections, and affective polarization seems to decrease again with time afterwards. So those are the three questions that I've now talked about. Some of the next steps would be to look back even further. We're also collecting data among adolescents aged 12 to 16 and see if we maybe there see it more of a development affective polarization or an increase over the different age groups. To look for adult comparison samples from the other countries to replicate our adult-adolescent comparison. And to work on the framing of the paper. Because as you can see, we have a lot of data sources, a lot of results, and we have to tie together a little bit more. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jakob, for this really interesting presentation. We open the floor for questions. Jim.
Thank you for the questions, very interesting. I think my question is knowing about the research question the difference of affective polarization across age groups. I'm not super familiar with the two data sets you're using, but I'm quite curious about whether there exists any variables related to political knowledge or political interest, because we are researching politics and we assume that everybody has so much interest in politics. And I'm thinking probably the absence of difference across age of affective polarization is because we don't consider this politics related variable if we categorize the population based on these variables. And probably for people for adolescents who have also already had basic knowledge about politics, and probably we can observe some difference there. And but for another group, then probably there is no difference, and that's why that when you consider the whole population as a whole, then these two effects just cancel out each other. That's why. So yeah, I'm wondering whether you research.
Yeah, no, super interesting point. I've looked a little bit at relationships between affective polarization and the different outcomes. So they are in the expected direction. So we see that people that are more interested, more engaged, and so on, that they tend to have higher levels of affective polarization, although this is obviously correlation. But what I haven't done yet is subsetting the sample and running some subgroup analyses. So I haven't looked at interactions between age and a different variable. And I think that might be something interesting to look at, and to also see what opportunities we have given our data sets. So we definitely have something related to, we definitely have political interest, but yeah, is there anything else you would, for example, recommend maybe interacting with age?
I'm just thinking.
Yeah.
Look at the culture, sure about what this culture is about. So political knowledge, political interest, these are the two variables jumping into.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's super interesting, because I also think that it is like, we look at it as a quite, I mean, age obviously is a relevant variable, but there's a lot of variance, especially if we look at adolescents within a certain age group. So yeah.
Yeah. If you includes the age group is from 10 to 25, right?
Depends on the sample a little bit, yeah.
So if they're university students, probably you can also ask about their majors. Major probably can also make a difference here. I'm just a random.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to Philip and then Nikki.
Well, thanks, Jakob. Good work. I had to think of creating the hating paper of like when populist gain representation, affective polarization goes up because they're hated. So I'm wondering whether that could be something you could also explore, like who for whom it goes up, and if it is indeed about output dislike and not like. That's one thing. And then a second point that is related to that is I never really liked the sort of equation of like in-group and out-group like at the same time. So for affective polarization, but rather separating it out a bit. So, and that is also related to the Sears piece that you were talking about, like the political partisan identification maybe manifests more, but does outgroup dislike also kind of go hand in hand immediately with that? And I think this minimal in-group paradigm doesn't hold as well for politics. I think there's something else might also be more necessary, and that might, so the long question to come to the point of like, is it really about socialization, the effect of the mechanism behind adolescence might be less positive? Or might it not be, for instance, exposure to new media, kind of campaigning, etc., which has also like changed over the decades? The younger people are more exposed to podcast media content at a younger age, which would be an interesting moderating effect. So like reaching the political news, etc. And it might also be warrant this separation again of in-group and out-group like. So does in-group like increase over the years? And does out-group like kind of like the least liked party? Like how much hated is the least liked party over the years? Yeah. And I think that might actually, or I could imagine that the latter might actually have a different trend that is now obfuscated by the combination.
That is interesting. Yeah, I think that's certainly something that I would want to look at. A little bit about like if this would pick up some of that, like the spread score. But I think it makes sense to look at the two of them, because we would expect, I actually don't know what to expect. So I think that's a good point to look at that. I looked a little bit at in-group liking, out-group disliking, and the split for the last research question. So for example, I wanted to see how does affective polarization, what conditions this change, and there it's both. So for participants whose affective polarization has increased, this is due to that they do like their in-group more and dislike their out-group more. But I think especially with regards to the developmental question, that would be super interesting. One other thing that is, but maybe also related to what you've said, is one thing that we were also thinking about was that adolescents might not even think about those different political parties, and maybe that's a little bit of the wrong question, or that we wanted to include also a question to find out a little bit what are the types of groups that polarize adolescents in a way. Maybe it's for them not as much the political parties, but that we can get it with this data. And I think you had a third point, but I...
No.
Okay.
Well, Nikki, Matthias, and then we have a question.
Yes. Thanks, Jakob.
Mhm.
There's a lot going on in my mind, but first, I wanted to ask, do you have any items on ideology or?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Do you, but ideology in the sense, in what way?
I don't think we have anything in the Rotterdam study. I mean, we have ideology questions in the list panel, and then in the iPad study, we have either left, right, or progressive, conservative, depending on the country, I think. But I haven't looked at it yet.
Okay, is that like a 10-point scale?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm thinking maybe those who are more extreme in their ideology are more effective and polarized. At least that's kind of what I'm going into right now. So you might want to split these two groups. But also about the way you measure effective polarization, is the thermometer measure towards parties?
It's parties, yes.
Yeah. I'm thinking you might want to, as you already just mentioned, different way of measuring effective polarization in the sense that you ask about people in their surroundings.
Yeah.
For example, who have a different opinion on something, on a topic that they also have an opinion about the opposite opinion. So how do they feel about that? Because that's also a form of effective polarization, of course. But a different way, instead of asking about the parties, because we see a lot of children or adolescents not really having strong feelings toward the political parties.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it makes sense to look maybe for a little bit more tangible measures, because I do think that there are some that are also a little bit easier to understand. We do see, I think, or at least I've heard from other people who also helped collecting this data, that adolescents between 12 and 16 struggle with some of the questions, particularly also with the feeling thermometer questions. So maybe that little way to get a little bit more at that, like to look for kind of more tangible measures. Obviously, I think one thing that is, you always strive to have a measure that is comparable, or like in a way.
Yeah.
And you have those feeling thermometers that have been in like the surveys for like the last, I don't know how many years. But I do think that it might make sense to adapt the questions. I guess ideally you would have a question that is so easy that the adolescents and the adults can understand it, because some of the questions are also so far removed, I guess, from the way we think about politics, that adults also might struggle with them. So actually, I think we may strive to create questions that are
But in the US, they also use this question like, would you be okay with your daughter or son marrying someone who votes for a different party?
Yeah.
And if you make some comparing
Yeah.
comparable item for these adolescents, at least that's what we try to do, but I told you already about that.
Yeah.
Work that well.
Yeah.
Or it's just not there.
Yeah. That's super interesting. There, I always feel like it's not quite the same, and I think it really depends what you care about a little bit. I think the one is a little bit more how you think about the political system and the political parties, and has maybe implications for that. Whereas the other one is a little bit more, how do you think about other people in society, and it also has more of like a behavioral component.
Yeah.
And I think that's super interesting.
Maybe we should at some point think together about how we can measure effective polarization among adolescents. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, we'll go to Matthias.
Thanks. My point relates to the first question and also your point, and one of the answers. It's basically a suggestion, I think. So you show that there is more effective polarization around the elections, right? So the reason could be that politics is then more salient. So that might also be one related variable to interact it with, because it could be that for people for whom politics is salient, that there is an increase in
Mhm.
And not for people who are, for who people, politics is not very salient.
Yeah.
And that is also related, I think, to what you said. So what are the groups that people identify with and not
Yeah,
with?
yeah.
And just, yeah, asking that question, how, I don't know how exactly, but how important is politics to you, or how something like that might be interesting.
Mhm.
Had that, I mean, if there is something like that in the data set, of course, and otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I think especially to use that in the first part as well, where we have the development. For the second part, I know that we have very limited moderators. It's political engagement, need to contribute to society, then future uncertainty. And I think how well they see themselves represented in society. And then obviously all the demographics, so age, gender, socioeconomic status. And the weird or puzzling thing is that with the change of affective polarization around the election, I don't find evidence for any interactions. But I think the variables that we have there to moderate the change across waves with, I think the variables there are also not great. So I think something, as you say, something around salience, something around news consumption, I think would be maybe just the better moderator to use there. But unfortunately, I think there we don't have a lot. But in the other one we have, I think, and there I'll definitely look a little bit more into those interactions.
Okay, I'll read out a question from online that's been put in the queue a while ago.
By who?
By Randy.
Welcome.
Welcome, Randy. First of all, a methodological idea. Is it possible to do a network approach to see affective polarization contagion amongst adolescents? Just wanted to inform you that that was proposed. But also, do you have any information about how parents' affective polarization influences their children's political polarization? In other words, are these two correlated?
So network approach, I think you have to respond to that. No, certainly I think it's very interesting, although we don't know how the adolescents in the sample are related to each other. So I think indeed it would be super interesting to see a little bit how more, I think maybe that's also something that Nikki was, or you have more of the class level data. I think this would be more interesting if you look at like networks and something like that. But yeah. And with the second one, I mean, I do think that's certainly the case. I mean, especially if you look at also the socialization literature, you do see a lot that, for example, that there is transmission of parties and identities, and in multi-party systems also specifically transmission of left-right ideology between parents and adolescents. And so I would assume, based on those two findings, that this is also the case for affective polarization.
Okay, and then we'll go to Bert's question.
And thanks, Jakob. I was almost thinking that you were presenting a book manuscript or a dissertation here in 10 minutes. I mean, it's great to see so much stuff materializing also so fast. One proposal that came to my mind when combining the conclusions of research question 1 and 2. So one is it's stable among adolescents, but then, hey, these adolescents are actually less polarized. So is this now, I mean, later in life, you become polarized, or is it a generational difference, or what's up there?
Yeah, I'm not sure with it, but I was also thinking about that a little bit. I do think that, I mean, we cannot exclude generational differences, but I don't think we have the data to look at that actually. If we look at the list panel overall, there I do think that there's a small positive correlation between age and affective polarization, so that I think it's around 0.12 or something like that. So people become a little bit more affective polarized, but maybe it would make sense to plot this relationship again and see a little bit like where's the traction, where's the increase, at least if we look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. One final question.
I had the same question. Why do you want to look at younger kids now? If you see that actually polarization is get old.
That's true. Maybe I should focus. I mean, the easy answer would be my PhD project is about adolescence. So that maybe makes finally some.
very developed. But no, I do think that it indeed makes sense to see, because I mean, we don't expect it to be like this, right? That there's a sudden jump then after 25. But maybe it would make sense to a little bit more exploratively look at where does it increase, and then since we do have those data across multiple countries, also does this increase replicate across countries? Because then we might actually see like an interesting development in a certain age span. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for all your questions. Thanks again, Jakob, for presenting. Really great job. Thanks.